This is Street Signals, a weekly conversation about markets and macro, brought to you by State Street Markets. I'm your host, Tim Graff, head of macro strategy for Europe. Each week, we talk about the latest insights from our award-winning research, as well as the current thinking from our strategists, traders, business leaders, clients, and other experts from financial markets. If you listen to us and like what you're hearing, please subscribe, leave us a good review, get in touch. It all helps us to improve what we offer. With that, here's what's on our minds this week. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not reflect those of State Street. This week, we continue a series of podcasts on Western politics with a conversation with Mick Mulvaney. Mick was a four-term Republican House representative from South Carolina and a former acting White House Chief of Staff and Office of Management and Budget Director during Donald Trump's first term as president. As you might expect, the range of topics we cover is vast, whether it's a discussion of the state of the upcoming midterm elections or the role that the U.S. is positioning itself for in geopolitics, or what legacy Donald Trump will leave behind when he finishes his second term in 2027. Mick's experience in being part of the policy process proves invaluable. Hope you enjoy it. Well, Mick, great to see you again. On my last episode, I spoke to Alistair Campbell, who we all spoke at our event in London a couple of weeks ago, and I opened the question with a similar question I'm going to open with you about Britain being ungovernable. In the U.S., the two-party system is not so fragmented, but we're in an era that it seems like compromise is harder than ever to get to. And have we in the U.S. moved to a system of governance almost by crisis?
I guess, that's one way to look at it. I start at the other end of the spectrum. I start where the country is.
Yeah.
People always ask me, Mick, why is Washington broken? I'm like, Washington's not broken. Washington's functioning exactly like people want it to function. I know that sounds crazy, but it's not like there's some evil hand that reaches out of Washington, D.C. and picks Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Lauren Boebert and brings those people to Washington. The people who live back home look their options over and say, this is the person that I want to represent me. And the country is very divided right now. You see all the polling data, what are the people looking for in their next candidate? Someone who fights for them. It's a fighting mentality, not a compromising mentality right now. The country says they want compromise, but they don't vote that way. Now, you can go into why, how gerrymandering plays into that, which is a fair criticism. But the bottom line is, look, if people wanted a different outcome from Washington, they would elect other people to represent them. And they're not really doing that on a great level. So are we ungovernable? I think the country might be ungovernable at this point, but we'll muddle through it just as we have had every other time we've been in a situation like this.
Yeah. And what do you see as the means by which things get done in Washington? What gets the dial moving? What provides the momentum?
Well, momentum towards what? Towards change?
Towards change, towards enacting meaningful policy.
It'll probably have to be some unique individual. I'll give you a classic example of what I think that one of the biggest lost opportunities of this term will be in Washington, D.C., this Trump term, which is I really do think there was a chance for real, and to use an overused word, comprehensive immigration reform. Why? Because I think Trump was interested in it, and he alone could sell it to other Republicans. And that's how you get compromise in Washington. Compromise is not getting the other side to do what you want them to do. The compromise is getting your side to do what they want you to do. That's what Ronald Reagan was great at. So I think that Trump could have been the type of person who could have delivered that particular compromise. I think that's what it's going to be going forward. One of the disappointments I think that a lot of us look back on is that regardless of whether or not you voted for Barack Obama, he sold himself as sort of a unifying sort of force. That turned out not to be the case. Biden, ran as the easy to get along guy, deal maker Joe. That turned out not to be who he was in the White House. At least Trump ran as what he is, which is, look, I'm going to divide and conquer. And that's pretty much how he's run the country. So I think that to see real change, you're going to have to see truly unique men and women rise to the top in both parties. And that could happen. That could happen this midterm. It could happen 10 years from now.
You mentioned last week as well when we were speaking about Trump's use of executive action as a means by which he can get things done. And just looking into that a little bit, of course, you have, and tariffs are the perfect example of where there has already been pushback by the Supreme Court, which potentially limits some of his freedom to act using executive powers. Does that inevitably invite judicial pushback, or has he learned how to navigate those waters a bit more effectively?
Oh, we certainly learned how to do it, and we're doing it better in the second term than we did in the first, just because this is a skill. You learn how to do this, right?
Yeah.
Writing executive orders is not something that they teach in law school. Every president is trying to figure out a way, has been trying to figure out a way to use more executive authority. That's the natural tension between the legislative and the executive branch. It's not a Republican versus Democrat thing. Each president does hundreds, if not thousands, of executive orders. I think they're misunderstood, though, Tim. People, think they're law, and they are not. They are effectively instructions as to how the executive branch of government is supposed to function and perform. Anytime an executive order goes outside of those boundaries, you can expect the courts to sort of kick back. The president has been given authority, for example, to set trade policy by previous Congresses under certain circumstances and conditions. If you get beyond those circumstances and conditions, you can expect the court to push back, which is exactly what they did on the, I think it was the 301s that they did
Yeah.
back at Liberation Day. So yeah, you're going to continue to see this tension between the various branches. That's the way the system is supposed to work. But if you ask me, will the next president be using more executive authority? Yeah. I think each president successively tries to expand executive authority, and until Congress figures out a way to start grabbing some of it back, that's not going to change. But keep in mind, Congress would have to agree on what it would look like to grab it back, and they can't even agree on that.
With the Trump administration, based on the tariff response from the Supreme Court, does it, it seems as though, and this is perhaps a misguided way of looking at it, but it seems as though they're defined almost by opposition in both directions. They're opposing the Democrats, but also just finding opposition or responding to opposition, I should say, from outside the administration. Does it look at the Supreme Court now potentially as playing oppositional politics to it?
Probably. I mean, and I know that, Democrats will say that the Republicans have been doing that forever anyway, and Republicans will say Democrats have been doing it forever. So it's that there's not much, meaningful to come out of that discussion. I have been surprised by a couple of the positions that Judge Ketanji Brown has taken.
Mm.
As someone who has practiced law when I didn't practice law, I've been a lawyer for, 35 years. I found her tone to be a little bit beneath the office, but that's the style we live in the day. So everything in the country is politicized, so I don't know why we would think that the Supreme Court would be any different. Elections have consequences, and who you elect to office in the White House and the Senate especially makes a difference on who is running the Supreme Court. I know the Democrats are really upset that there's a majority of conservatives on the Supreme Court. Guess what? So was I, and so are my parents for the last 70 years before, before the turn of the last century. It's just one of the ebbs and flows. I know there's always talk on the left about expanding the court, which is a really, really dangerous road to go down to, because they're right, you can do it, but if once they do it, what's to stop the Republicans from doing it? We end up with a court with 25 people on it, depending on who's in office. That's silly. If you can't win at the election booth, how else do you try and win? Well, you try and change the rules. If you're not winning under the current rules, you try to change the rules. And right now, the Democrats have just not won the White House at the right time to make the picks for the Supreme Court. So they're trying to use other rules to change that sort of environment. I don't think it's going to go very far, but look, in this day and age in Washington, anything is possible.
Well, that brings up the topic of social media, which is another really interesting facet of the discussion we had on a panel last week. And its rise, of course, has been, and Trump is sort of the archetype of using social media as part of the political process. But these ideas like packing the court, it seems like they come from social media and they get amplified in that channel to become something that you and I are discussing today.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering just how far along this process you see it going, how much worse can that amplification and the contribution to polarization get through this channel of social media?
Oh, I think very dramatically.
Yeah.
I think AI is just going to supercharge it. I can't tell now if the source materials I get on the internet, on Twitter, for example, on X, are reliable or not. I mean, I have to say, I will get stuff that looks like it's been tweeted by the President of the United States, and I have to send it to my former White House team and say, can anybody confirm that this is actually what the president put out? And it's really, really hard to do. So it's just going to get harder and harder. I was just with some folks in New York City last week talking about data centers, and they're absolutely convinced that the pushback against data centers is a Chinese misinformation campaign. But when it looks legitimate, when it looks homegrown, when it looks, credible, a lot of people actually believe the stuff they read on the internet. So yeah, the opportunities to listen, tearing down has always been easier than building up. And social media is certainly in a position to continue tearing down the institutions and the unity in the country, which is what they've been doing for the last 10 years.
Is there anything you can talk about with respect to the foreign influence in that and its contribution to the breakdown of the discourse? Supposedly common knowledge that that's what's taking place, but do you have any insight on that?
No, not really. Again, it's hard to know what to believe, right?
Right.
That's why one of the reasons I get the Wall Street Journal in print is at least I can figure that maybe that's probably not been AI, changed on its way to my screen. So
Yeah.
it is difficult to get good information. I think you and I talked about this in the meeting we had with Alistair last week, which one of the biggest disappointments to me, one of the few things that I really, really miss about being in the White House. I loved my job, wouldn't change it for anything, but don't really have any interest in going back. But for maybe the access to information that I had.
Yeah.
I had access to the best information in the whole world when I was in the White House, and that is truly, sadly unique and unfortunate. A lot of folks don't have really, really good information. We just don't know if what we're seeing is true, and that's a real tough place to sort of start from when you're trying to make decisions.
Well, it's of course influential during political cycles, and I wanted to kind of pivot to where we are in the U.S.
Yeah.
today, as we're approaching the midterms just under 5 months away. The conventional thinking around this is, as you tend to see in when parties who are in control, you tend to see the backlash in the midterms, and the expectation is the Democrats retake the House, but the Republicans maintain control of the Senate. I mean, is there any challenge to that conventional wisdom that you see? Just broadly, there's some other topics I wanted to
Yeah.
get into.
If I was going to challenge it, listen, I'm with you. As I said last week at the conference, I think the Republicans are doomed to lose control of the House, and the Senate is probably a coin flip. But I saw some data over the weekend that was really interesting to me, Tim. It was some generic ballot data. This
Mm,
is a question that people get. Keep in mind, most people don't know who their member of Congress is. I'm not making that up. So the generic ballot question is: look, who would you be more comfortable with being in control of Congress, Democrats or Republicans? The margin there right now, according to the data I saw over the weekend, it looked like it was fairly credible, was about 5% advantage to the Democrats. I would think that to be much higher.
yeah,
That's not very high in our world. That's not anything close to a wave election. I thought that number might be 10 or 15% in favor of the Democrats. I cannot imagine that that number is so tight, relatively tight, because the Trump administration is doing anything right. I think they're still struggling to figure out how to get out of this war and get prices down, deal with inflation and so forth. So I don't think it's the Republicans really doing anything right as much as it looks like the Democrats doing something wrong, that despite the weaknesses that the war especially has exposed on the Republican side of the ledger, the Democrats haven't been able to take much advantage of it. The 5% generic ballot, that's about the basic point, starting point. That's the sort of the
right.
structural rate. At any time, if you ask that question, 5% would be about neutral. So that tells me that the Democrats have a long way to go to take advantage of what I see as a really good situation for them, a really good environment. But again, there's a difference between people voting for you and voting against somebody else, and you gotta give them a reason to vote for you.
Yeah, and you've run for Congress 4 times, and I'm curious if the timing for the Republicans is it too late? I just looking at the polling of independents, especially Trump has lost a lot of support from independents versus where when he was elected to his second term a couple years ago. Is there enough time to tip that balance now? If it's so close, is 5 months
Yeah,
enough?
it's a yes and no answer, and here's why it's no. Here's the reason why no, there's not enough time is that it's very, very hard for the government to move quickly. So even if you do policy changes today, they take a long time to kick in. And in fact, the risk that you run is saying, "Oh, we fixed it by doing X, Y, Z." So do something. Oh, we solved the war, so gas prices are going to come down. Well, if that hasn't happened in a month, you're going to look foolish, and people are going to think you're lying to them. You're not. It's just you said it on day one. It doesn't kick in until day 90. People don't understand that. We face this trouble, for example, Tim, with infrastructure all the time. You pass an infrastructure bill, and you tell people how great it's going to make their lives, but it doesn't affect them for 6 to 10 years. So there's
Yeah.
there's a gap there. So that tells me that, it will be really hard to move this battleship that is sort of moving towards a Democrat majority, at least in the House. The flip side of that is you would be stunned, and probably not positively so, by the percentage of people who don't make up their minds on congressional races, most races, until the day they walk into the ballot box. You and I are different because we follow it, but most people don't. They don't follow politics every single day. They might follow it for a week or two before an election. They got better things to do. They're running their lives. It's why we have a representative government. They're supposed to be able to go on with their lives. So, it's just, if you can have a really good run up to the election, the momentum counts in elections, and if the Republicans have a little bit of wind in their back at election, 2 weeks out, that could really spell for a different result than what a lot of people, including myself, are thinking.
As far as Republicans are concerned, Republican candidates, that is, given some of the drop in polling of support for Trump or his the public opinion backing him,
Yeah.
he is the leader of the party. He is probably the most consequential politician of my lifetime, probably most of ours. Do Republicans, though, given the loss of standing he's had the last, whether it's over tariffs or over Iran, do they use this as an opportunity to run towards him or run away from him in this cycle?
It depends on what district you're in. There's probably only 45 or 50 competitive districts. If you're in a really
Yeah.
solidly Republican district, as soon as you get through the primary, you don't make it doesn't make any difference. And by the way, there's Democrat races just like that as well. That
Yeah.
election is essentially done in the primary. If you're there, you can be with Trump 100%. How could it possibly hurt you? If the more you move towards those competitive districts, more towards the center, for lack of a better word, might you find some Republicans looking for some places to sort of get a little bit of distance between them and the president? Yeah. Maybe 100% voting with the president doesn't sell as well in a swing district as 92% does. Because you can say the other 8% or when you did something to help the district, even though it went against the leader of your party. That's a compelling argument. Both Democrats and Republicans try to make those arguments from time to time, especially in those swingy kind of purple districts. So I think a lot of it depends. But yeah, I get asked the question this way, which is, do I think we're past peak Trump in terms of his political influence? I think the answer is probably yes. He still has tremendous control over the party, as
Mm.
evidenced by his successes in many of these, almost all, with a couple small exceptions, of these Republican primaries. But generally speaking, I think we've seen the peak of his political power. That not to say it's still not high. It's just not going to be as high as it was before.
Who do you think, among a range of people, it doesn't have to be one person, but who would be his natural successor? I mean, is it automatically JD Vance, or are there others within the party that you see kind of picking up his version of MAGA and running with the vision that he's had for the last 10, 11 years now?
Yeah, there's only one Donald Trump, and I think
Yeah.
if anybody tries to be the next Donald Trump, they will fall flat on their face to do so. You can't run as somebody else anyway. You got to run as who you are.
Yeah.
But he's a unicorn. I don't think we'll ever see the likes of him again in my lifetime. Maybe it was Reagan and now Trump. It's just a political force. Maybe you can make the argument that Obama was in 2008. But I mean, the man Trump is just he's a one off. I do not see there as a natural sort of successor. I don't think he thinks it's a natural successor. I think he's looking his hand over, and he'll wait and see. And keep in mind, he'll be the sitting president during the entire Republican primary, so he'll be able to weigh in every single day on who did well in the debate, who did great in this caucus, who he liked on TV, who didn't do such a good job. It's almost like the television show Apprentice, at
Yeah.
the presidential level. He'll be able to sort of weigh in on that. So no, I do not see him endorsing anybody early. He'll say nice things about a lot of folks, but I don't think there's anybody that he sort of looks at and says, this is my guy. This is the next person. I'm going to back him right now.
I wanted to ask about your time working with him in his
Yeah.
first term. Can you give people who are listening some insight, things that they might not expect or things they might find surprising about the way that he works based on the time you spent with him?
To that last point, Trump always perceived himself as a moderator, a mediator, a judge. He loved conflict. He manages by conflict.
Mm.
And I'll give a specific example of that. Back in the first term, whenever we had a trade meeting, and we had a lot of trade meetings, he would fill the room. In fact, we joked that we would have to sell tickets, and he'd fill the room with a group of people on one side of the argument who were free traders and a group of people on the other side who were strict protectionists, and would watch them go at it. And I've seen some very, very, vibrant discussions, for lack of a better word. And he loved it. That's what he always thought. If you put smart people in the room and let them fight, that the good ideas would come from it. So that's sort of how he manages. That makes it a challenging place to work sometimes because you're always, at other people's throats. But that's the the law of the jungle. And that's sort of how he managed. The other thing he does that I don't think people realize is he does think out loud. He
Right.
floats ideas. The classic example from this term is the press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu when Trump floated the idea seemingly out of the blue that we were going to turn Gaza into a resort area with golf courses and casinos and stuff like that. I was watching that live on television. Going, okay, that's just him sort of floating a balloon. He maybe
Yeah.
heard an idea, maybe read something, maybe somebody said something in an Oval Office meeting, and he picked up on that. So he's going to take it out there. And then, of course, if it doesn't go over, he'll just say, we'll move on to something else. So he does think out loud. And part of the artistry of trying to interpret Trump today is, when is he really telling you what's going on? Or when is he sort of thinking out loud? When is he trying to sort of gauge which way, the momentum is going and so forth? There's an art to doing that.
Is that intentional on his part?
Oh, sure. Yes.
Yeah.
I'll never forget, we talked to him one day. Someone mentioned the name of our policy on Taiwan, and the formal name of American policy on Taiwan. I don't know how it got this name, but it's strategic ambiguity. That's what we do. Is we're not for Taiwanese independence. We're not against Taiwanese independence. That's strategic ambiguity. I remember when Trump heard that the first time, he goes, strategic ambiguity. I love that. That's what I am. I'm strategically ambiguous. I mean, that's so, yeah, he does that. He does not want to let anybody know what he's thinking. I call it, the better way to to describe it might be this cultured unpredictability.
And when it comes to those debates that he orchestrates and brings in, is there an element where he ultimately just wants to hear both sides and goes with his gut? Or is he truly open-minded about those types of debates?
Well, I don't know the difference between those two things.
Yeah.
I think he's interested in what other people have got to say. We all are going to have some pre-existing sort of biases one way or other on most issues, not on everything. There are really some issues, Tim, that you and I could come up with that we probably haven't thought about that much. So there are out there, but on the big stuff, trade, for example,
Yeah.
Trump knows about where he is. I think those meetings were more to get into implementation and details and how to best achieve the end that he wanted. But he wanted to hear from the entire spectrum of folks on that policy issue.
This is a markets podcast, so we do kind of have to talk about
Sure.
the nature of bond markets, especially. But that really gets when it comes to what you're an expert on, fiscal policy, particularly given your time as director of Office of Management and Budget. I wanted to ask again this week, and we discussed this last week, about U.S. fiscal largesse and how we're running the largest peacetime deficits. And
Yeah.
so far, really, there's been no punishment for that from markets. And I'm wondering if you think there ever will be, and what efforts can be made, if efforts will be made, towards correcting that by the fiscal authorities.
Okay, the second half is easy, which is no. Congress doesn't know how to spend less money. They're all interested in spending more. And, look, before I'm so quick to sort of condemn my former colleagues, I do have to ask you, if you, Tim Graff, had a printing press in the basement of your house and you could run it limitlessly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 30 years, 40 years, and there was no apparent harm done to really anybody, would you be wrong to continue to use it? Or at least, would you be tempted to continue to use it? The answer is probably yeah. So, I mean, that's what's going to happen. Washington won't change. Again, go back to the original comment we talked about, until the voters change. Right now, the
Yeah.
voters don't want people to spend less. They want them to spend more. If you're Republican, you don't want Democrats to spend more because you don't like what they're spending it on, but you do like what Republicans are spending it on, and you want them to spend it. So no, I don't see the discipline coming from within. As to, is it going to break down? Sure, it is. But, when it comes to this, I sort of feel like the homeless guy standing on the corner with a cardboard sign that says, "Repent, the end is nigh." Sooner or later, that guy's going to be right. But I've been wrong about the impact of the debt on the economy since I got into politics in 2006. So, anybody knows, I should have happened by now, but it
Yeah.
hasn't. So I have got no clue if it's tomorrow or 10 years from now.
What was your thinking and assessment on the Doge effort from Elon Musk at the beginning of Trump's second term? Do you think that was serious attempts at reform, or was it just kind of theater to tick all the right boxes?
No, I thought, in fact, I thought it was serious, and I thought it was serious because they turned it into theater. And I'll say why I say that. I was in charge of Doge last time. We called it something else, called it
Yeah.
government restructuring. But we failed miserably. I did, because I was never able to articulate in a way that got people's attention. You never heard about the government restructuring effort, my guess. You have heard about Doge. And I love the fact that they elevated this and they ran a PR campaign and they changed the name and they got a great deal of attention and people actually started paying attention to it. That said, that's just the beginning of the job. Then you actually have to do it. And I do remember commenting that I thought that when at the outset, when Elon was involved, I said, I think he's going to end up finding out it will be easier to get to Mars than it is to fix the federal government. And I think he's figured that out now because, he's given up and moved on out of Doge. So look, it's a great effort. I hope that they've started something that is sustainable. If you are, regardless of what party you are in, the stories of government waste and inefficiency would curl your hair. I remember real briefly when I started this, I guess it's 8 years ago now, I asked for a list of all of the, reports that OMB was required by law, by Congress, to produce that no one had asked for in 10 years, and we stopped counting at, like, 2,500, okay?
Mm.
So there's imagine how much work that takes that is completely valueless. The stories like that are legion in the federal government. Everybody's making a big deal about how Elon Musk is now worth $1 trillion. We spend 7 times that this year. It's an obscene amount of money, and there's going to be waste, there's going to be abuse and fraud and inefficiencies, and we should fix it. If we look back on it 10 years from now and it's worked, well, thank Elon. My guess is it's a real uphill climb because people care more about it now than they did before, but they're not caring enough to change their voting patterns.
This is possibly a stupid question. Is that fraud and waste and just the woolliness that you talk about enough to meaningfully correct deficits, or is it really going to take entitlement reform and these kind of fixed things that we have that are just going nowhere, but could potentially see some tweaking that you could ultimately achieve greater savings?
I mean, if you assume that if the fraud is just 10%, that's $700 billion. That's a substantial sum of money.
Yeah.
But by the way, when your deficit is $2 trillion, then no, it doesn't close the gap. The real problem is not the inefficiencies; it's just the size of the government. It's not coming down. So look, it doesn't hurt to ask for more efficiencies and so forth, but you're not going to solve all of your problems. Keep in mind, whenever people say, "Oh, our entitlements are driving our deficits," there's a kernel of truth to that. But let me ask you a question. Do you know of the $40 trillion in debt that we have right now, what percentage of it is attributable to Social Security? The answer is zero.
Yeah.
None. Zero. Social Security is not allowed to run a debt. It's not allowed to borrow money. So they had they've lived off their savings for the last 30 years. So it does not add to that $40 trillion. Now, at some point it might, because Congress might say, "Oh, we're running out of money in Social Security. Let's just fund it out of the general account." And in that case, they could change the law. It would add to the deficit, but you're $40 trillion and Social Security hasn't contributed a penny to that. So the reasons we have a deficit is just because, generally speaking, we like spending more than we have because we don't see the downside to it.
As we get towards wrapping up, I wanted to spend some time on geopolitics before my final few questions. And we are, of course, we're recording this. This, by the way, won't be going out for a couple of weeks. So this, hopefully this won't be old news, but we are basking in the glow, at least in markets, of an agreement on a ceasefire with Iran. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on any disconnect between what investors are thinking today in terms of a positive outcome and what you see as a potentially more complicated reality over the coming couple of months.
Yeah. I mean, listen, announcements are easy.
Yeah.
Agreements are hard. I'm not even sure what's in this one. In fact, as we sit here and record this, my understanding is that we won't get a chance to see the text of the memorandum of understanding until after it's been signed. And of course, all that does, as best I can tell, according to published reports, is sort of solidify a ceasefire for 60 days, open the Straits of Hormuz for 60 days, while Iran and the United States negotiate on the really, really hard stuff, like what happens to the nuclear material, what happens to the nuclear program, what happens to the sanctions, what happens to the money that we've frozen. Those are the really, really hard things. So it's a respite in my mind. It's a move towards a long-term solution, but it's far from a long-term solution. If you think this is going away, then I don't think you grasp how difficult a final agreement is going to be to arrive at.
Yeah, and I'm curious, especially what your thoughts are for the U.S. in the region, because I read something earlier today. It was really striking to me. The agreement, as we so far understand it, is to be signed in Switzerland, but all the parties involved in negotiation, or the mediators of this, are Pakistan, Oman. The countries involved are not Europe, not the UK. The old Western powers are not really involved in this, and I'm wondering what that means for the U.S.'s relationship to, well, let's start with the Middle East, first of all. Is this a situation of trying to calm what has been a lingering tension for 47 years vis-a-vis Iran, and then try and get out of Middle East entanglements? Or is this actually the opposite? Is it getting more involved?
I think that's the $64,000 question. Is the end result of this war, does it contribute to the long-term stability in the region, or does it make it worse? I think that's going to be the measure, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you're going to know if this was a good deal for several years after this. I do know the relationships have changed. I know that we're much closer now to our Gulf state friends than we were beforehand. Yes, we're drifting naturally away from Europe anyway. That doesn't mean we're completely ending that relationship. It's just, look, go back to the National Defense Strategy document that prioritized, I think it was Asia first,
Yep.
the Western Hemisphere after that, then the Gulf, and Europe was at the bottom of the list. That's not a new document, by the way. That's not
Yeah.
a new ordering. That was under Obama. The pivot to Asia was during the previous administration. So look, those what's an important area of the world is always subject to change. And I do think right now that Asia and the Western Hemisphere and the Gulf are a little bit more important to us strategically than Europe is. And I don't think I think that trend is going to continue. It doesn't mean the end of NATO. It just means when you sit down to president sits down to set, his priorities for the day, how we get along with Germany is not going to be number one on the list. It might be number five.
Mm.
So that's probably justified under the circumstances.
And about the relationship between the US and China, I think it's about a month on from Trump's meeting with President Xi. And,
Yeah.
looking at it from the outside, it looked as though it was, if not détente, at least sort of a move towards it. And, we've seen potentially the worst of the trade tensions come through last year. I mean, how do you think Trump would define success for the US's relationship vis-a-vis China?
Status quo. That's success. Look, I call it a cold peace as opposed to the Cold War we had with the Russians. They don't like us, we don't like them, but they're too big for us to push around, and we're too big for them to push around. So I think you've sort of find this stasis, this status quo that sort of works for everybody. There will continue to be skirmishes over, drugs, maybe one direction or access to critical earth minerals or whatever. So, but I think generally speaking, there's not going to be a great kumbaya moment, a massive trade agreement. We are tremendous friends, nor I think we're going to start shooting each other. I think we're
Yeah.
just sort of trying to figure out a way to navigate the planet together so that we don't end up at each other's throats. So I think it's that sort of that stasis, that status quo that everybody's happy with that you'll see for the foreseeable future.
That relationship, trade, especially both in Trump's first term and for the first half of his second term, clearly dominate as a policy issue. Is that going to be part of his legacy, the reorienting of U.S. trade
Yeah.
relationships? What is his legacy in your view?
Well, it
What
certainly
does he
changed
leave
the
behind?
party. I mean, there's no free trade wing of the party anymore. So he has changed the face of the Republican Party. There might be a couple free traders left, not many. So certainly that will be part of his legacy. I think another part of the legacy is going to be, and this doesn't get nearly the attention I thought that it might, but there's other things that are, grabbing attention now, which is the southern border really has been fixed. That, everything I see seems to indicate that it's fairly secure right now for the first time in a really, really long time. So that's another sort of signature event. I don't think the tax cuts, people don't care that much, or they say they do, but they don't. The immigration thing meant a lot to people, and the trade thing still means a lot to people, even if they're not in manufacturing. It's a national sovereignty thing now. So I think those are probably his biggest policy legacy items.
And what about his impact on statecraft and politics? What do you think he leaves behind?
Yeah, great question. I'm fascinated to see the type of person that wins in 2028. I'm not talking personalities. I'm not talking about names. The type of person. Trump has taken statecraft down a different path. Does the next person take it further down that path? Or is it sort of reactionary? Go, no, let's go back and get something that feels more like a traditional presidency. Biden, I thought, wasn't capable. I do believe he was limited in his abilities and so forth, especially in the last couple of years of the administration. So I don't know if that's a fair test. Be curious to see the personalities. Is it the person who goes down and continues sort of the Trump arc, or readjusts and goes back to the way things were, at least in terms of the statecraft, to use your word? The fascinating thing to me, Tim, is going to be that for both parties, this will be the first real generational change in 25 years.
Mm,
So, I mean, but face it, starting with Clinton and then going to Bush, you had a little bit of a variation with Obama, but not much. And then Trump, and then Biden, and then Trump again. We've pretty much been governed by the same graduating class of high school since 1992. All those folks were born within 3 or 4 years of each other. So now, for the first time since the early 90s, you're going to get true generational change in both parties.
yeah.
And that will be fascinating to see what that looks like. That hasn't really happened since 92, and before that probably goes back to Kennedy, when you had the first wave of World War II veterans who were getting elected. So anyway,
It's up to our generation, Mick, I think.
yeah, well, I'm almost 60. And that's about where I think you end up, somebody between the age of 45 and 60,
Yeah.
which is what, 20 years younger than Trump at least,
Yeah.
and 20 years younger than Biden.
Actually, about you, what has life outside of politics been like for you?
Oh, listen, I tell people that being near politics is a lot better than being in politics. And they ask me if I want to go back into politics, and I say, absolutely not. And they say, why are you so definitive about it? I said, well, because I got tired of being nice to people I don't like. And that's a big part of politics. And it's
Yeah.
just, it would suck the life out of me. So now I'm happy to go off and just sit in my office here and work and comment on things, given my apparently what is a unique and varied history in American political system. So I've been involved in now about 20 years, and maybe I bring some interesting perspectives.
Absolutely, you do. I mean, outside of the information you got, is there anything else that you miss about being in the room?
No, I loved it. It was great. I
Yeah.
wouldn't change a minute of it. But no, it's not the type of thing that if you understand what the job is, which is to tell the president the things he doesn't want to hear, that's not the kind of thing that gets you to jump out of bed every single morning. I mean, that can weigh on you. There's a
Yeah.
reason that the average life expectancy is about 15 or 16 months for a chief of staff, which is exactly how long I lasted. I think Susie Wiles just passed that.
Right.
So, look, it's a rough job. Again, I loved it. Wouldn't change it at all, but got no interest in ever doing anything close to that again.
And happier days ahead for sure.
I hope so. They were happy then, but I'm
Yeah.
always good with happier. No problem with
Yeah.
that.
Fantastic. Well, let's run with that, Mick. It's been fantastic to catch up with you again. Fascinating conversation as it was when we met last week. I thank you so much for your time. You've been so generous.
All the best. Thanks very much, Tim.
Thanks for listening to Street Signals. Clients can find this podcast and all of our research at our web portal, Insights. There, you'll be able to find all of our latest thinking on markets, where we leverage our deep experience in research on investor behavior, inflation, media sentiment, and risk, all of which goes into building an award-winning strategy product. And again, if you like what you've heard, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review. We'll see you next time. For informational purposes only, and is not intended to suggest or recommend any transaction, investment, or investment strategy. It does not constitute investment research, nor does it purport to be comprehensive or intended to replace the exercise of an investor's own careful, independent review and judgment regarding any investment decision. This communication and the information herein does not constitute investment, legal, or tax advice, and is not a solicitation to buy or sell securities or any financial instrument, nor is it intended to constitute a binding contractual arrangement or commitment by State Street of any kind. The information provided does not take into account any particular investment objectives, strategies, investment horizon, or tax status. The views expressed herein are the views of State Street as of the date specified and are subject to change without notice based on market and other conditions. The information provided herein has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable at the time of publication. Nonetheless, we make no representations or assurances that the information is complete or accurate, and you should not place any reliance on said information. State Street hereby disclaims any warranty and all liability, whether arising in contract, tort, or otherwise, for any losses, liabilities, damages, expenses, or costs, either direct, indirect, consequential, special, or punitive, arising from or in connection with any use of this communication and/or the information herein. State Street or its affiliates may from time to time as principal or agent for its own account or for those of its clients have positions in and/or actively trade in financial instruments or other products identical to or economically related to those discussed in this communication. State Street may have a commercial relationship with issuers of financial instruments or other products discussed in this communication. This communication may contain information deemed to be forward-looking statements. These statements are based on assumptions, analyses, and expectations of State Street in light of its experience and perception of historical trends, current conditions, expected future developments, and other factors it believes appropriate under the circumstances. All information is subject to change without notice. This communication or any portion hereof may not be redistributed without the prior written consent of State Street. Past performance is no guarantee of future results.